Hello comrades, I'm Martin Levy, editor of Communist Review, and I'm here to talk to you about the 150th anniversary of the birth of arguably the greatest revolutionary ever known, Vladimir Ilych Lenin. This happens on the 22nd of April. Now the current issue of Communist Review, here it is, features Lenin on the cover, as you can see, and it's got 3 articles inside, equivalent to half the publication, dedicated to the anniversary. The first of those articles was written 50 years ago by Rajani Palm Dutt, editor of Labour Monthly, obviously for the centenary of Lenin's birth, and in that article he pays tribute to Lenin as a creative Marxist who rescued socialist theory from dogmatism and revisionism, showing how monopoly capitalism had led to imperialism and recognising that Russia was the weak link in the imperialist chain. He also says that Lenin's true legacy was the Soviet construction of socialism despite the Nazi blitzkrieg of the Second World War and the Cold War after that, and he stresses Lenin's indomitable revolutionary determination, deep humanity and closeness to the people. At the same time, he remarks that Lenin recognised the bitter and indubitable truth that in the face of the terrorism of the counter-revolution, there was no alternative but red proletarian terrorism, while putting forward the perspective that on the basis of the sacrifices of the Soviet people, other countries may travel by a different, more humane road. The third article in the journal, on the national pride of the great Russians, was written by Lenin himself in 1914. It's included in this edition of the journal because of the current debate around socialism and patriotism. And here Lenin says that national pride is certainly not alien to class-conscious Russian proletarians. He says, and I'm quoting here, "We love our language and our country, and we're doing our very utmost to raise our toiling masses, i.e. 9/10 of the population, to the level of a democratic and socialist consciousness. To us it is most painful to see and feel the outrages, the oppression and the humiliation our fair country suffers at the hands of the Tsar's butchers, the nobles and the capitalists. We take pride in the resistance to these outrages put up from our midst from the great Russians." And furthermore, he says, "The proletarian revolution calls for a prolonged education of the workers in the spirit of the fullest national equality and brotherhood. Consequently, the interests of the great Russian proletariat require that the masses be systematically educated to champion, most resolutely, consistently, boldly, and in a revolutionary manner, complete equality in the right to self-determination for all the nations oppressed by the great Russians." I'm going to come back to this later. The second article, written by myself, is entitled "Leninism, Democracy and Britain's Road to Socialism." It looks at the relevance of Leninism to revolutionary strategy in Britain today, and I make the point that democracy is not just a bolt-on for that, but central to it. Now, in his famous pamphlet, The State and Revolution, Lenin described democracy as, I quote, "a form of the state, on the one hand representing the systematic use of force against persons, and on the other signifying the formal recognition of equality of all citizens, the equal right of all to determine the structure of and administer the state." Now, while he agreed with Engels that what was called the Democratic Republic, albeit still a dictatorship of the capitalist class, provides the optimum conditions for the working class to build the struggle for socialism, he also shared Engels' opinion that universal suffrage was nothing more than, again I quote, "the gauge of the maturity of the working class." Nonetheless, he recognised that, in the era of imperialism, the Democratic Republic was under constant threat. Nowadays, we would not dismiss universal suffrage so lightly, as it has been gained through struggle, and we have a much broader understanding of democracy than just a form of the state. For us, democracy not only refers to political parties, trade unions and a host of other bodies, as well as the state, but we also talk about democratic rights in the sense of equal rights with all forms of discrimination and infringement on civil liberties being termed undemocratic. Now, Lenin may not have used democracy in such a broad sense, but it runs like a thread throughout his approach, as we can see from Stalin's foundation of Leninism in 1924, a lecture dedicated to the recruits of the Lenin enrollment of the Soviet Communist Party. Here, Stalin observed that Lenin continually stressed the need for theory, and particularly important was the concept of the bourgeois democratic revolution and the socialist revolution as two links of the same chain in Russia, with the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry passing over in the course of struggle to the dictatorship of the proletariat. Nowadays again, we would use the term working class state power rather than dictatorship of the proletariat, but the concept is still the same: rule of the working class over the capitalist class, democratic in a new way for the proletarians and propertyless in general, and dictatorial in a new way against the bourgeoisie. And as you see, I've quoted again there. A vital Leninist theme identified by Stalin in this context is that of class alliance, in the Russian case between the workers and small peasants. And a further democratic theme that he identified was the national problem, which we've talked about already. But Stalin stressed that Leninism broke down the wall between whites and blacks, between Europeans and Asiatics, and thus linked the national question with the problems of the colonies. Oppressed peoples, he said, should have the right to independent existence as states, and the road to the victory of the revolution in the West lay through the revolutionary alliance with the liberation movement of the colonies and dependent countries against imperialism. In working out a strategy for revolution today, we need to build on these concepts, while incorporating the ideas of those who have developed Leninism to apply to different circumstances than in Russia in 1917. In particular, Italian communist leader Antonio Gramsci, writing in his prison notebooks, noted that with the stabilisation of capitalism, Ilych, that was his term for Lenin, understood that a change was necessary from the war of manoeuvre applied victoriously in the East in 1917 to a war of position, which was the only form possible in the West. In Russia, he said, the state was everything. Civil society was primordial and gelatinous. In the West, there was a proper relation between the state and civil society, and when the state trembled, a sturdy structure of civil society was at once revealed. The state, he went on, was only an outer ditch behind which there stood a powerful system of fortresses and earthworks. What does that mean? Well, although we live under a bourgeois dictatorship, the capitalist class rules by a combination of coercion and consent, maintaining its hegemony by binding other classes and strata to it. The war of position would therefore require the step-by-step penetration and conquest of the ruling apparatus, and therefore of the educational and justice systems and the administration. To do this, the working class would have to engage not only in economic and political struggles, but in ideological and cultural struggles, to build alliances with other classes and sectors, and to make its values those of society as a whole. Gramsci also noted that threats to the democratic republic become particularly acute when the ruling class feels itself in extreme danger. Then, he said, if the ruling class has lost its consensus, that is, if it no longer leads but only rules, it possesses sheer coercive power. This actually means that the great masses have become detached from traditional ideologies. And furthermore, the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, morbid phenomena of the most varied kind come to pass. Now here, Gramsci was referring to Mussolini fascism. His comrade in arms and successor as Italian communist leader Palmiro Togliatti observed that fascism still needs a mass class base and an ideology to bind together its supporters. But even in the absence of fascism, democratic rights are, as already remarked, continually under threat from imperialism. Defence and extension of democratic rights therefore has to be central to the strategy for socialism. It is an essential part of the war of position. The same goes for national interests. In 1944, addressing Italian Communist Party cadres in liberated Naples, Togliatti noted that Mussolini's fascists had accused the communists of being the enemies of property and the family, of supporting violence, of being subverters and destroyers, of being defeatists and anti-national. whereas in fact it was fascism which had ransacked the whole of Italy, had made violence the fundamental law, had caused cities to be reduced to rubble, had brought disintegration and distress to families, brought the army to unprecedented defeat and carried out a crime against the nation by waging war. We are, said Togliatti, taking up and making our own the banner of national interest, which fascism has dragged through the mud and betrayed. Now a similar theme was adopted 8 years later by Stalin, calling on Western Communist parties to pick up the banners of bourgeois democratic freedom, national independence and national sovereignty. Addressing foreign delegates at the CPSU Congress that year, he said, "Now there is not one remaining trace of liberalism. The principle of equal rights for people and nations is trodden in the dust, and it is replaced by the principle of full rights for the exploiting minority and the lack of rights of the exploited majority of citizens. The banner of bourgeois democratic freedom has been thrown overboard. Without doubt, you, the representatives of the Communist and Democratic parties, must pick up this banner and carry it forward." And he went on, "Now the bourgeoisie sell the rights and independence of their nations for dollars. The banner of national independence and national sovereignty has been thrown overboard. Without doubt, you, the representatives of the Communist and Democratic parties, must raise this banner and carry it forward if you want to be patriots of your countries." So, the issues of democracy and national rights have to be at the heart of any strategy for socialism. In fact, a year before Stalin's speech, Britain's communists adopted the first version of their long-term strategic programme, the British Road to Socialism, but the prompt for it was actually external rather than internal. In a meeting on the 31st of May 1950 between Stalin and Malenkov on the one hand and British Party General Secretary Harry Pollitt on the other, Stalin called on the British communists to adopt such a programme in which they would say that they did not want to weaken Parliament, Britain would reach socialism through Parliament via a democratic republic guided by, quotes, "a coalition of workers, working intelligentsia, lower class of cities as well as farmers." That's the end of the quote. What he's referring to there was a class alliance. And Britain would not be destroyed but strengthened by putting an end to the abnormal mutual relations between peoples that are now under the British Empire. Now named Britain's Road to Socialism, in short the BRS, to reflect the fact that Britain is a multilateral country, the updated 8th edition of the BRS has just been released. It continues the party's characterisation of Britain's economic structure as state monopoly capitalism, identifying monopoly and finance capital as the main enemy of working people. It puts forward an alternative economic and political strategy to engage with class struggle on the economic, political and ideological and cultural fronts. The three pillars of that strategy are a left-wing programme, including a host of democratic and internationalist as well as economic policies, an essential part of the war of position, a popular democratic anti-monopoly alliance centred on the working class and seeking to bring together into struggle all those whose common enemy is state monopoly capitalism. This is in direct line from Lenin's concept of class alliances, but leans heavily on Gramsci's concept of hegemony. And finally, the winning of left governments, based on Labour, Socialist, Communist and Progressive majorities at Westminster and in Scotland and Wales, committed to carrying out the left-wing programme. Struggle is the key issue, because it is only in this way that people can be helped to understand the interconnectedness of the issues and the need to build support for the comprehensive left-wing programme. In that context, the Labour and Progressive movements need to develop a mass understanding that democracy is not an institution but a process of emancipation, and to make the values of cooperation, collective interests, multiculturalism, internationalism and rational materialist thought into those of society as a whole. Mass mobilisations will be needed to achieve the election of the left governments. Even bigger mobilisations will be needed to overcome ruling class resistance and sabotage. Enormous confrontations will signify that the revolutionary process has reached its critical stage at which the question of state power is on the order of the day. 150 years after Lenin's birth, Britain's road to socialism is the best way for Britain's communists to honour and take forward Lenin's heritage. Thank you, comrades, for listening.